Good evening, everyone. Thank you. We are here tonight because we have an opportunity to study the most incredible sermon ever given in the history of the world, and given by the only one who lived every single principle perfectly. So we come together as imperfect people studying this perfect message delivered by our perfect Savior, trying our best to encourage one another to apply these principles into our life so that we can please God. It is truly a blessing that we have to be able to come out and be together with those who are truly the salt of the earth and the light of the world. So it's good to be here this evening. Before we get into our study, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our great God, we are indebted to you every single day of our life for how much you love us and care for us and how much you watch over us. We are in awe of you, we are in awe of your Son, and we are continually amazed at how you have put together this incredible book that we studied tonight with this incredible sermon that is so practical thousands of years later. Help us to take the words that we learned today and have an open heart and open mind and be challenged by them, and to be committed to living these principles out in our life. Help us to help one another be light to the world and the salt of this earth. Through Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, so let's summarize a couple things before we actually get started into our text for today. Jesus spent all night up on a mountain praying before he appointed his apostles. And he appointed his apostles out of a larger group of disciples. And so after he did that, he comes and stands on what Luke refers to as a plain, where he is healing all kinds of diseases and infirmities. He's even casting out demons. And it appears at this time, he sort of goes maybe somewhat away from the crowd. And even if the crowd is present, I don't think we can deny the fact that Jesus is turning his attention primarily to his disciples. He's letting them know what it will take from them in order to be part of the kingdom that John the Baptist was preaching about being near, that he has been going throughout Galilee preaching that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And if you want to be part of this kingdom, you have to have a certain character. You have to be certain things. You have to be someone who is poor in spirit. You have to be someone who is willing to mourn your own sins. You have to be meek. You have to be someone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. You have to be someone who is merciful, somebody that has a pure heart, and somebody who is a peacemaker. And if you do those things, you will be blessed by God in various ways. But after he lists all those blessings, he says, you will be blessed by God in all these ways, but you will not be blessed by people of this earth. Because people of this earth will turn around and persecute you. And when they do that, you ought to be exceedingly glad. For you have a great reward in heaven, and you're in good company because they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And at this point, Jesus turns his attention to a couple comparisons, which really, in context, sort of blows my mind. You be this way, the world's going to treat you this way, but then you turn around and you be a blessing to the very people who are persecuting you. You be salt to this earth, and you be light as well. Jesus is telling them that although the world will reject them, that they in turn are really going to be the earth's only hope, because they have the only message that is worth hope, that gives hope. And they are going to be following the only one who offers true hope. So let's read together Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 13. We're going to read 13 through 16. It says, you are the salt of the earth. And again, put yourself on that mountain, okay? And Jesus has just gotten done telling you all these things that he expects you to be. And then he says the world's not going to handle that very well. And maybe you just have left that great multitude of Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes, people from all over the area. Because remember, people from all over the area came. Galilee and Judea and Samaria, on the east side of the Jordan River, way up north. They came to hear Jesus and be healed by them. And then all of a sudden, Jesus turns to his disciples, the ones that have been following him for longer, the ones that weren't really necessarily in and out. They were his disciples. And he says to them, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. And maybe he looks directly into your eyes and he says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set up on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but they put it on a lampstand that it may give light to all those who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. There's some important points that I want us to make sure that we keep our eye on through the course of our study together this evening. There are some things that in a very positive way Jesus is going to say about our influence. He's going to say our influence is real. It's tangible. You can see results from the influence you have in this world. It is also observable, and I think this is a huge point that we can't lose sight of. Our influence is not primarily our influence. It's God's influence. So a lot of times you might say things like, hey, act a certain way because of your last name. And that's fine, right? That's fine. But really, we act a certain way because of Christ's name. Our influence is really his influence. When we lose our influence, we are robbing God of being able to influence the world. That's why our influence is important. Not because we can have the praise of men, but because God can be praised through us. And he is giving a couple warnings in this passage as well. He's saying, don't ruin your influence by contamination. And the second thing he's going to mention here is don't ruin your influence by hiding it. It needs to be observable so people can see God in you and that you really believe in him. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about how our influence is real and the value of salt. On a sliding scale of being cheap to ultra expensive, how expensive is salt? Pennies, right? I'm shocked. You go to the store, you buy a big old thing of salt for less than $1. You know, you go to Aldi, I'm sure you get a lot less than that. Shelley was needing some salt. She has like 6 of those containers of salt. I mean, we got all kinds of salt. And for us, what is the primary purpose of salt? Flavor, right? That is our primary service or purpose for salt, but that was not their primary use of salt. And I think because we don't live in that environment, we do need to take a few moments to consider how important salt was to them. They would build their cities next to salt mines. You think about where to build a city, we might think of a waterway, we might think of a way that the railroad comes in now, or a transportation hub. But salt was so important to them. If they found a salt mine, they would say, this is a good place for us to make a city because we have access to salt. They would fight wars over salt. You know, I don't know if we're allowed to say this or not anymore, but chances are we have made a few decisions in our history and fought wars to protect something valuable to us, and that's oil, right? It's oil. It's the lifeblood of our country and our economy. We have to protect oil. We need oil. And I saw something recently where it looks like Ukraine has 500,000 tons of lithium. Not the reason probably that there's a war in Ukraine, but it might be a reason why some other countries are there to protect and make sure that that does not get in control of somebody else. We find valuable resources that God has put on this earth, and we do whatever we can to be close to them, have them available to us, and to protect them because they are our lifeline. That is what salt was to them. Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt sometimes, and we get our word salary from the word salt. You've heard the expression, they're not worth their salt, or they are worth their salt, and they're worth their salary. You know, they're worth what it would cost to pay them in salt. That's how valuable salt was to the people of the day. And if you have, I sent an email out yesterday, if you've had time to think about how do Christians preserve the world, purify the world, and flavor the world, we're going to get to that question in just a second. Do I have microphone runners today? Okay. So if you have an answer to that question, you go ahead and raise your hand and then get a microphone to you so you'll be ready to answer that when it comes about. The benefits of salt. First of all, salt preserves. Any of you, when the hurricane came, worried about your refrigerator, your freezer? That's our way of preserving food, right? And that's valuable to us. We need that. We don't want the power to go out, because if the power goes out, we can't have food. That was really the main reason why I didn't want the power to go out, to protect my food source. Well, as soon as you kill an animal, or as soon as you catch and kill a fish, it starts to deteriorate, right? So the best tasting food, a lot of times you'll have, and some of you probably have done this, you've been out by the ocean, and you've seen them bring the fish in. Maybe you picked out a fish while it was live, and you had them kill it because it's fresh, right? Well, if you don't eat it right away, eventually it's not going to be any good. And so you have to find a way to preserve it, and that's what salt did. They would take salt, they'd put it down, they would rub the entire meat or fish with salt, and it takes the water out of the fish or out of the meat so that bad bacteria can't grow in the food. Now, good bacteria can grow in the food, but bad bacteria can't grow in the food. And so it's going to be preserved. In addition to that, they would sometimes put sugar on top of it, at least in our country later on, because the sugar, not that it would protect it from bad bacteria, but it would allow the good bacteria to thrive. Again, preserving that food even longer. And you might add smoke to it. Not smoke like I like to do, where you smoke it at a temperature of 250 where it's cooking it, but where you actually smoke it at a temperature lower than what it takes to start cooking. So somewhere around 80, 85 degrees. You put smoke to it. You know, my dad grew up, they smoked their own meat. And they had a separate place where the fire was over here, and it would go into the smokehouse, and it would have a very slow what it's doing is drying it out. You got to get the moisture out of it. So that's what salt did for them. So when Jesus is talking to them, they understood how significant salt was to the world and for survival. In the Bible, covenants were oftentimes approved by salt to preserve the covenant. All the meal offerings, all the meat offerings in the Old Testament had salt attached to them. Not only was it used to preserve, but it was also used to purify. We still use salt to purify today, don't we? You ever gargle salt water? Saltwater pools. The salt is used to kill germs. In a very unique way, it separates the two elements, and the chloride becomes chlorine, and it kills the germs in the pool. I was reading something where sometimes in places where the water isn't good, the sun purifies it. They'll put it in plastic bottles, but the light has to get through it. And so in order for the light to get through it, they'll put salt in it. And the salt will attract some of those things out of it so that the light can get through it, so the light can purify it. You can put salt in a wound. We use that in a negative way, right? I'm going to put salt in the wound. Oh, it burns. But it does the same thing that the meat does. It dries it out so the bacteria can't live in that. And so it is a way of purifying you as well. In Ezekiel, they're told the newborn babies were to be rubbed with salt. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, when Elisha wanted to heal a water source, that was bad water. He said, the city's great, but the water's bad. He takes salt and he puts it in the water, and God performs a miracle there in order for that water to be pure again. And then salt adds flavor. I don't think we need to prove that, right? You all have salt shakers at home. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but in this room, there's probably been one or two of you that have been told by a doctor to eat less salt because it's so good you put too much salt on your food. Job chapter 6 and verse 6 says, can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? My soul refuses to touch them. They are loathsome food to me. So salt is very valuable. And I think that exercise is important because to us, the biggest value of salt is the taste. That would have been the least important thing of the three things that we talked about. So here's the question. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to think about that. How do we as Christians then preserve the world, purify the world, or add flavor to the world? Brian has one. Be shy. I've talked enough. It's your turn now.
I guess there's a simple example, like sometimes if you're around people in the world and they know you're a Christian, they seem to kind of govern themselves a little differently. They might even apologize, like they'll say a cuss word or something. It's like, oh, sorry about that, sorry. And while certainly that's not the ultimate goal, right? I don't want them just to behave around me, right? And then when I leave, they just do whatever they want. Obviously, I want them to do it for God. But there is, you do see a bit of that kind of preservation of, hey, they could be acting way more wickedly, but because they're in your presence, maybe some of it is guilt, but maybe some of it is they're just inspired and they just want to be a better person and they wish they could, live that way. So that's just a small scale example of how we preserve.
All right, so sometimes the way that we live causes other people not to continue to sin. We've all probably experienced that when we stop telling the dirty jokes or stop using the bad language because you're in their presence. So that is a small way in which it happens, for sure. It's an important way. Phil?
I like what Brian said, and I agree with it. And I think the other thing is being united with Christ. If we understand what we're united with, who we're united with, what he possesses, we have the greatest thing to offer a lost, dark world that doesn't understand it. They're looking for answers in their life of why they're here, of what they should be doing with their life. And part of what we do as Christians is because we've been saved, we've been redeemed, we've been reconciled back to the Father, we should have a peace about us and a sense of well-being that they don't have, that would cause them to want to have that as well.
Yeah, without a doubt. Our influence should be something that they look up to. And then going to what you started out with, we have the only message that can purify anybody, right? So Romans chapter 10, we read this recently. How are they going to know unless someone goes and shares the gospel with them? So by our influence in the way that we live and by teaching them that the one that we're attached to, then we're showing them what they need to do to be right with God. How do we need to get rid of their sins? How they need to get rid of their sins. How God can do that for them. So in that way, I think we preserve the world. Mark 16, 15, and 17 says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So there's that preaching of the gospel to the lost is a way that we purify the world. What else? Raise your hand, you get a microphone. All right, Joe has one. I think there are many times, all right, I'll let you have the microphone. Go ahead. I don't want to take yours in case.
I've got the microphone. I think another thing is the way you phrased it, important to maintain. That means you had it. I think it's also self-reflecting. We put salt on a wound, so it needs to heal us as well. Because we can't be hypocritical. We can't go around saying, oh, you need to do this and you need to do that, because it talks about later on about the mote in the eye versus the speck and stuff. So I think it also needs to work on us as well as those around us.
No question. He's going to get into that in more detail later, that you have to be living this yourself. You can't be trying to get the speck out of somebody else's eye when there's a plank in your own eye. So that's an important aspect of it as well. Brian?
Yeah, and I was thinking about the flavoring aspect. And the world should be able to see, like, man, it's just better being around Christians. You know, they're just more positive and uplifting and encouraging, and they do acts of kindness, and they're just not, you know, grumbling and complaining like all my friends or whatever. And hopefully that is the case. Otherwise, we might be losing some of our saltiness. But people should walk away saying, wow, like, it's just better to be around them. And so we kind of make the world taste better in that sense.
And what does the Hebrew writer say about all the people who did all that suffering into the world? What does he say about them? The world was not worthy. In other words, what were they? They were salt of the earth, and the earth didn't even know that they were salt. So they were providing a flavor, a service to the world, making it something important. And I think that Brian's point is so important, because and I think Phil made the same point, when somebody sees our life and sees the peace that we have and the joy it is for us to serve God, that should be something that drives them to Christ. It's an influencer, right? Yes, sir.
This has made me think about the book of Judges and how we have this record of what a world is like without worship of Jehovah God. When everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there weren't people like Joshua and the elders that lived around Joshua preserving
That's a good
the
point.
people of Israel, and without the worship of God and the influence of people trying to serve God, we have time and time again, we've seen this play out. And it's a little bit more difficult to see it play out in our own lives, maybe, you know, just because we're bound by time, but we have a record of what happens when people don't teach other people to glorify God.
Yeah. So we see examples all through the Bible history. Judges is a great example of that, or what it looks like when there's no salt and light. Right? It's always disaster. When there's no salt, no light, there's disaster. Gail?
I was going to say also, always understand that even when you don't know somebody's watching, they are seeing something in your life. We had a neighbor the other day that said, I really don't think you're going to Sunday brunch every week. What church do you go to? So they saw us get up every Sunday and be dressed up and get in the car. So you don't always know, but your example sometimes
Absolutely.
can show that to people.
Yep. It's observable, right? It's observable. A couple other things. There have been times throughout history where God has preserved the world because of the righteousness of a few. You know, Sodom and Gomorrah would have been preserved if what? There was more salt there. I know there's a lot of, you know, it's supposed to be an area maybe where there is some salt, but where there's people that was salt. So it's very important. If there were more light in Sodom and Gomorrah, it may have been preserved. Noah preserved the entire human race because he was salt and light, and he tried for a whole bunch of years to be salt and light into the world, to no avail. David's life of salt and light preserved his lineage for years. There were times where God says, if it weren't for David, even after David was long gone, if it weren't for David, I wouldn't be keeping the promise that I made to him. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we could do that. And here's a challenging thought. I told you that this message is going to challenge us. Is your life such that God looks down and says, well, there's a lot of righteousness down there. There's a whole bunch of righteousness there. And if there were 9 other people in Sodom like you, would the city have been saved? If there were that much light in the world. We are to purify the world by our influence. And the Hebrews chapter 11 passage, which I said, we should make the world a better place. What happens when salt loses its saltiness? What is it good for? Nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now, I told you, really, so this is sort of our warning, right? One of our warnings. Salt can be destroyed in 2 ways. One is to separate the elements. I don't think that was worrisome to them, right? I don't think that that's not how they took this, right? The other way salt can become worthless is by contamination. You get so much contaminants in there, then the salt is no longer something that can be used to preserve. Can't be used to purify. You're not going to rub that in your wound. It can't be used to do anything good. And so I think that's an important thing for us. Let's look at a couple of verses, but think about this question, because if you have an answer to this question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Matthew 13, 36 through 43. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went to a house, and his disciples came to him saying, explain to us the parable of the tares. What was the parable of the tares? Isn't this where the field was contaminated? The field was contaminated with weeds or tares. And so he says, look, at the end of the day, this is going to have to be figured out, but it really ruined that field because it was contaminated with tares. And 2 Corinthians, let's see. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, it says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. And in verse 17, come out from among them and be separate, not contaminated. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 talks about do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And James chapter 1 and verse 27 says, pure and undefiled religion is this, to visit the orphans and widows and keep oneself unspotted by the world. So we can't be contaminated. If we're contaminated, we can't preserve the world, we can't purify the world, and we can't give the world the flavor that it needs. So the question there is, why is it important for us to maintain our flavor or saltiness, Brian?
Yeah, I think the reason salt is so effective is because it's so different. It's radically different from like the steak that you're putting it on. And if you were to sprinkle little pieces of steak on the steak, it wouldn't really do anything. It's the same. But salt is just so distinct. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is just examining my own life and asking, how different am I really from the people in the world? Am I speaking differently? Am I acting differently? Am I thinking differently? Me and Ryan and Carrie, and we joined a bowling league recently. If anybody wants to bowl, just let us know. We can always do the fourth. But I'm looking all the time, at the people in the league and just like, okay, and how am I different from them? And I don't mean this in like a moral superiority sort of way, looking down on anybody, but just like, am I saying the exact same things they do? Am I getting furious when when the ball doesn't go where I want it, like they do? And that's just a real challenge to just always maintain that difference. It's what the Bible calls holiness, or set apart.
And there's so many things in the world that contaminate us. And if we're not proactive in this, we will be contaminated by the world. There's too many things coming our direction every single day, and the devil is trying his best to contaminate us, right? As best he can, so that we don't have any influence in this world. So that's why we have to be so careful what we allow to influence us in this world. And that's just a huge part of it. So what else? What is other important reason is it to maintain our flavor or saltiness? All right. What was your name again? Was it? Jordan. I thought I heard you say Jordan to somebody. Well, go ahead. Well, get a microphone, Jordan.
For one thing, just reading the text, God will view us as useless.
Yes.
If we don't, and that's, I don't know if I'd ever really sat on that word until tonight. If God views us as worthless because we are not distinct, that's to be viewed as worthless by God that's terrifying.
This is strong terminology, right? I mean, if I were to say, Terry, you are worthless. I mean, besides being punched by maybe Veronica, I don't know. You guys would just say, that's ridiculous. Terry has a lot of value, a lot of worth. right? So God says, if you become so contaminated that the world can't tell the difference between you and it, and you're not a light into the world, you're useless to him. He can't use you anymore. And that's scary thinking, scary to think about, that God would say, yeah, you've contaminated yourself so much that until you're purified again, until you're clean, I can't use you. You're useless to me. And none of us want to be there. Bobby?
Yeah, I think that, like people are watching, like Gail said, your kids watch you. Like, I think that if you're not practicing what you preach on a daily basis, like you're not gonna bring people to Christ. People, there's so much hypocrisy in religion. I've talked to many people about that, my own dad about that. And I think that the way you live your life, and it's the same in business, your reputation, you get one reputation, and it's how you live your life. That is what draws people to Christ. I've seen it so many times, what's helped me here, and there's people here that have done that. And if you don't have that, I think it's impossible, to help anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, and it's a fine distinction, but it's important in that salt isn't a flavoring. It doesn't add flavor. It's a flavor enhancer. It enhances the flavor that's in the thing we put it on. So we enhance each other and the world.
Yeah, okay. Very good. We enhance one another. And there's a huge point here, because we're going to move into this idea that it's observable. We are the salt of the earth. How good and useful to your food is salt that stays in the salt shaker? And sometimes I'm afraid that's sort of where we like to be, right? We like to be in the salt shaker because it's comforting in the salt shaker. And I'm around other salt, and that's good. I'm getting the flavor, and they're keeping me flavorful and all that good stuff. But if we never actually go out into the world, then we're missing out the whole point, right? Phil?
I think your question, it has so many different levels to it, so many different things to think about. But I think the most important one out of all of it is, the reason it's so important for us is because we are ambassadors for Christ. We're here to lead people to Christ, and that's the bottom line. That's what God wants to do with us as his people, to lead more people to glory. And we're not just telling them the truth. We're not just showing it to them. We want them to have it. And if we don't possess it ourselves and we don't preserve it for ourselves so that people can see what we have, we're not going to be able to help this mission to evangelize the lost world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We have to have it if we're going to share it with other people. So let's go ahead and move to the second point. First of all, influence is real. Second point, it's observable. Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. As Gail pointed out, people are watching you. Right? So it's a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. In order to help the world, we must be seen by the world. Christians are not isolationists. I mean, we homeschooled our kids, but that was one thing at the very beginning that we talked about, that if we're going to homeschool our kids, we have to make sure that they still are influential in the world. We're not taking them out of school to take them out of the world. You cannot take people out of the world. Matthew 10 and verse 16. Whoever's in the back is really helping me out here. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 16 says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And the point that I want to make from this is being exposed to the contaminants in the world is risky. But that's no excuse. That's no excuse. That's why we have to draw on one another to make sure that we're helping one another not to be contaminated by the world, and encouraging one another to go out into the world so that other people can see our influence. There is a risk, but that is no excuse. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 9 through 11. It says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people, yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I have written you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is sexually immoral or covetous or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. So I think there's a lot of very important points there. One is, it's so important that we help one another not be contaminated. Right? So if somebody's contaminated, who is a brother, who is one of these immoral people or covetous or an idolater, you have to get the contaminants out of them. So don't even eat with them until they get their life right, because they're useless to God. But what about the world? We must be equipped to influence sexually immoral people. We must be equipped to influence covetous people, extortioners, and idolaters. A Christian is in the world, not of the world, with a responsibility to the world. That observable influence is so important. James chapter 3 talks about showing the world by our good conduct who we are. Let me get through a couple more verses here before we start answering a couple more questions. James 1, 16 through 18, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of light. So there's two verses here. This and 1 John 1, 5 through 7, God is light. Christ is light, right? Christ, and in John chapter 8 and verse 12, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. And then there are several verses that talk about us being the light of the world. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Same with Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. I remember singing that song growing up. I don't know if we've sang it here since I've been here. We are the world's Bible. Another reason why it's so important that we do what we do, because you might be the only person how people are going to know what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. They're not going to read it. They've never read it. But if we live our life appropriately, they can see that in action, is another reason why it is so important. Let me look at our third point real quick, and that is our influence is for God. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. Why? And glorify your Father who is in heaven. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, when David sinned, God was upset. Why? Because he caused people to blaspheme God's name. When we become contaminated, it makes people say bad things about God, especially when we're claiming to be his people. And then in James chapter 3, the one who is wise should show by his good conduct. So we didn't get able to get to all of these, and that's okay. Who has been a positive influence on you and why? Who's been your salt, your light that's helped you? Anybody want to share that? I mean, I have a list of 6 or 7 here on my list, but at least maybe it gives you something to think about. And then start thinking, who have I influenced? Could my name be on somebody else's list on who has influenced them? So think about that. I know that's sort of a private thing. You might not want to share with that. What are some practical ways what can you do to increase your influence? And I want to challenge you to this. How much influence do you have with people who aren't in this building? That's a challenge. That's a challenge for preachers. I'm telling you, because we spend most of our time with salt. And so you think, what kind of influence do I have with people in the world? So we do things, and occasionally, and in a couple Wednesday nights from now, we're going to have a time. We're going to be away from here because they're going to put carpet in here, and we're going to have a time to tell Bible stories. How many people do you think you have enough influence over that you could say, hey, why don't you come and listen to some Bible stories? How many of your neighbors do you think would say, you know what? If you want me to go, I'll go. You have that much influence with me. Yeah, you have influence on if someone's going to buy a certain car, or someone's going to do this, somebody's going to do that. But what about the important things? And I think that's challenging to me. Maybe it's challenging to you as well, because we tend towards being isolationist. That's sort of what we feel comfortable doing, and we can't do that. We got to have influence in the world. And so you got to ask yourself, what influence do you have in the world? What influence do you have with people that you work with? Could you get them to spend 6 hours doing something? Can you get them to spend 2 hours doing something? Or if you suggest it, would they say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that? And I think those are important things for us to ask ourselves. We talked a little bit about this when we had our study about edification and the Nehemiah book. And we mentioned things like invite your neighbors over more. Talk to them more. Shelley has been so good. She knows everybody, almost everybody's name in our building, in our section. And she talks to them on a regular basis. Helping our neighbors with the flood, we have or the hurricane, we have a chance to help people who are in need. That is being a light into the world. And the other question there, I'm sure we'll think of more, and that is how can we as a congregation be more of a light into our community? That's what we want to do together. Questions for next week, I have them right here. They'll be in the back, but I'll pass them out as I go down the aisle.